Dr. Bajalan, it's a pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me. I want to speak with you about your book, which is titled Studies in Kurdish History, Empire, Ethnic, and Islam. And to do that, let's start with some basics that may turn out to be quite complicated. And my first question is this: who are the Kurdish people?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think at different points in history, we can talk about the Kurdish community in different ways. But, in essence, a kind of short way of thinking of it is that they are one of the, people groups that inhabit the Middle East. Now, obviously, the dividing lines in terms of culture, ethnicity between different people groups sometimes we think of those as kind of hard differences, but the reality is there's always a lot of overlap, intermarriage between different groups in the Middle East. But, we have this kind of register of ethnic difference, if you'd like to talk about it in that way in the Middle East.
Yeah.
And we talk about different sort of ethno-cultural groups, Turks, Persians, Arabs, Kurds, Baluch, etc., etc. So, in a kind of big picture way, if we want to talk about, who the Kurds are, we might think of them as one of the ethno-cultural people groups that live in the Middle East today.
So would you classify Kurdish people as an ethnic group, as a nationality, or as a linguistic group? And you also use the word community when I asked you the question.
Yeah, I like to use the word community because, there is an extensive scholarly discourse about, the meanings of terms such as ethnicity, nationality,
Yeah, yeah.
linguistic group. There's a big discussion within academia about how to use these terms because they can mean things in different contexts. Certain identities can be envisaged in different ways. So, for example, like, I assume a lot of your listeners are American, right?
Yep.
So, in America, you might talk about, let's say, someone who's an Indian American, right? And you say, oh, they're an American citizen, but they're of the Indian ethnic origin, right?
By Indian, do you mean Native American or from
No, I
India?
mean from South Asia, right?
Okay, South Asia.
From South
Okay.
Asia. But if you go to India, right? India is the kind of nationality, and there's hundreds of different ethnic and linguistic groups
Yeah,
inside India as well.
yeah.
So, what is an ethnic group? What is a nationality? It's very, it depends on what you mean by those terms. In English, for example, when we think of nationality, we often think of it as a people group with a state, right?
Exactly. Yes. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, but that leaves you kind of like with interesting examples. We could say Britain is a nation, but then does that mean Scotland isn't a nation? Wales isn't a nation. Ireland isn't a nation. You have this kind of this term which is used in different ways to refer to people groups. So when I say kind of ethnic group, I'm thinking of a community that is envisaged perhaps in cultural terms, sometimes in racial terms, sometimes in terms of sort of common origin. Uh, but that doesn't preclude the idea that that group could also be imagined as a quote unquote nationality, as a people who, at the very least, have the right to express self-determination in the form of national self-determination. Claiming nationhood in the modern era is a political claim, right?
It
If
is. It
you
is.
claim to be a nation, if you say you're a nation, then you're putting forward the right to national self-determination. Now, that national self-determination might not be exercised in the form of creating your own sovereign independent state, but it might be exercised in, let's say, having an autonomous region within a
Yeah.
kind of broader federation and things like that. So,
Religious rights, linguistic rights, and what
right,
have you. Yeah.
exactly. You
Yeah.
could say, like, we're a nation, and it may seem kind of paradoxical, but people envisage the concept of nationality in different ways. In the modern era, we live in a world of nations. Before 200, 250 years ago, people's social identities were linked to, religious groups, their village, their social class, their profession. That's how people identified. In the modern era, people identify with this concept of being part of a nation. That's kind of the building blocks of the modern social and political order, that we're all part of a nation. You can't opt out of being a part of a nation, right? But how, what a nation is imagined in different ways by different people. Let's just say, for example, even in America, you can have liberals who will say, being an American is about, buying into the American dream, into our shared political institutions, into our shared culture. It's not about race. It's not about ethnicity. It's a kind of voluntaristic thing. You become an American, right? But then you might have, let's say, a white supremacist says, like, all these, you could have moved here, 100 years ago, but you're not, an Anglo
Yeah, yeah.
Protestant, so you can never truly be an American. So some people might have imagined their nationality in terms of, you know, a kind of voluntaristic shared culture. Some might imagine nationality as something organic, something ethnic, something that
Yeah.
is essential to you. So we have a term, ethnicity, nationality, all these things, but they all kind of overlap and allied with each other and can be quite confusing when people use the term, nation. One of the
And
things.
some of the terms can be used for intentionally to take advantage of certain political situations, ethnicity versus nation, or what have you.
Yes, exactly. So, for example, you could say, for example, someone might refer to a group as an ethnic group in a way to say that actually they're not really a nation.
Yeah.
Another person might actually use ethnic group to prove that they're a nation, say that actually they have this
Yeah.
shared common origin. But what's interesting is that the what is a nation is one of those things that everybody kind of thinks that they know what it is, right? When you really drill down and start thinking about it and think, wait, like, what are the defining characteristics of a nation? Okay, well, what about language? Well, in some cases, language matters, but in Switzerland, there's definitely something called like a Swiss national identity, but they have four official languages. So,
Yeah.
is language a thing? Is it religion? I mean, maybe in some places it could be religion, but in other places, in Germany,
It's
they have
not.
Protestant. It's not. They have
Well,
Protestants.
let's dig into those two specific characteristics that you brought up. Um, is is Kurdish related to any Middle Eastern languages like Farsi, Turkish, or
Yeah.
Arabic, or is it a standalone language, kind of like Armenian, as I understand that language to be?
No, Kurdish is a Indo-European language. It's closely related to Farsi. It has, and when we talk about Kurdish, actually, we aren't talking about a single language. We're
Oh,
talking we're talking about a kind of a language family in a sense. Um, you have, people talk about different dialects of Kurdish, and there are certainly like different spoken dialects of Kurdish, but there are also different literary dialects of Kurdish that are used as well, both
I didn't get
historically,
that last point. There are also different literary.
literary,
Okay.
yeah, written versions of
Okay.
Kurdish as well.
Yeah.
Some of that is to do with the politics of the modern era, but it goes back to before the modern era as well. But Kurdish is an Indo-European language. The dialects of Kurdish spoken, let's say, closer to Persian populations are more intelligible to Persian people. There's a lot more, like, for example, you go to a place like Kermanshah, uh, you know,
Which is in Iran.
which is in Iran.
Mhm.
A lot of people speak Kurdish there, but their dialect has a lot of, let's say, Farsi vocabulary in it and things like that. So, Persian speakers often go, oh, I can understand so much Kurdish. But then you go to a place perhaps like Suleimania, which is on the Iraqi side of the border. It's a bit more difficult to pick up those terms. And then you go to other parts, there are, quite different grammatical structures and different vocabulary as well.
So, is there evidence that it was also like this, let's say 200 years ago, 300 years ago?
Yes, I mean, there's
Oh,
evidence this going back right down to the, you know, earliest accounts of the Kurds in at the beginning of the Islamic conquest. So, for example, the Arab historian Al-Masudi in the 9th century, he's kind of takes a look at who the Kurds are. He's like, okay, there's this group of people called the Kurds. These are their myths of origin. There's a couple of different myths of origin. I think this one's the best one, and they all speak. They speak well. Interestingly enough, when Orientalists initially translated this term, they translated it as Persian. They said they all speak Persian, but actually the word that Masudi uses Ajami, right? Which
Ajami.
which
Okay.
is Ajami was a term that has over time, it means convert, but came to be applied to the peoples of Iran. So when he writes Ajami, I don't translate it as Persian. I translate it as Iranic. So like he's an Arab writing, says these guys all speak some kind of language that seems a bit like the languages they speak in Iran. But then he goes on to say each tribe speaks its own dialect of Kurdish. So Kurds speak Ajami, but every tribe has its own dialect of Kurdish as
Interesting.
well. So there's always been linguistic diversity amongst the Kurds. And one of the things I find interesting is, and I don't have an answer to this, is were dialects that were Indo-European, Indo-Iranian dialects, were they defined as Kurdish because the people speaking them were Kurdish, or were the people defined as Kurdish because they were speaking that dialect? If that makes sense
Oh,
to you.
it does. It does. Interesting.
It's because, for example, some dialects of Kurdish are actually not even from the same branch of the two main dialects of Kurdish are from the same, common root. There's Kirmanji and Sorani, right? But
Okay.
then you have these other dialects of Kurdish like Gorani and Zazaki, which are actually from a different branch of the Indo-Iranian language family tree, but they're also called Kurdish and have been called Kurdish for a long time. So my question is like, the question I've always wondered is actually, how did these dialects come to be grouped as being Kurdish? Was it the dialect that was getting people defined as Kurdish, or were these people called Kurds? And when people saw them, it's like, well, they're speaking some kind of Iranian dialect, so this must be a Kurdish dialect, right?
Interesting. And do all Kurdish people that speak these different dialects, can they understand each other
To varying degrees. It
to
depends
varying
on your
degrees?
educate. I mean, it depends on your education level. It depends. Like, for example, it's you know, the Sorani and Kirmanji dialects, the two main dialects,
Mhm.
you can kind of, if you're used to it, you can understand them, right? There are some quite important grammatical differences, but they are intelligible if you're familiar with them, right? They can be difficult, if you're not, but it's understandable. Within those kind of the subdialects within them, yes, people can understand. So, for example, you know, uh, people from people from Iraqi Kurdistan, they don't have any problems communicating with people from Iranian Kurdistan because they largely speak the kind of same dialect. They might have different words for things. So, for example, in Iraq, when they talk about cars, they say se'ara, which is the Arabic word. And you want to guess what Iranian Kurds say? Machine, right?
Machine,
Yeah,
yeah.
but everybody knows it
Which is
because they
it comes from Russia, actually.
which
That's the
comes from
reason.
Russia. So,
Yeah.
some of the loan words, in modern Kurdish, some of the loan words, depending on which country you're in, you'll get the loan word from the country you're
Interesting. I asked that question because in the context that, uh, as someone who speaks Turkish from Iran, understands it anyway. If I bust out and listen to something from Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, or Turkey, I would have a very, very, very hard time understanding it. So,
But if you were, for example, people who are, Turks from Turkey who are educated in Turkish or from Azerbaijan who are, they wouldn't really have too much difficulty
that's true.
communicating. If you're not educated in the language, you might only be able to understand your particular very narrow
That's
dialect.
true. That's true.
Now, obviously, when you get to things like Kazakh, and those are a little bit different, but they're a bit more distant
Of course.
from the thing. But in terms of understanding each other's dialect, a lot of it comes down to kind of education and familiarity, especially with Kirmanji, which is Kirmanji is spoken predominantly in Turkey, but it's also spoken in Syria, parts of Iraqi Kurdistan, as well as in parts of Iranian Kurdistan, particularly in the West Azerbaijan province along the borderline.
I see. Let's close this segment with this question. What about religion? What
Mhm.
religion do Kurdish people in the Middle East practice?
um, the majority of Kurds are, of course, Muslims. You do have certain uh, religious minorities amongst the Kurdish community. The Yazidis are probably the most famous. There is obviously a kind of discussion and debate about whether Yazidis are Kurds or whether their own ethnic and linguistic group. And, that's kind of an interesting question because it does point to the fact that Islam came to be, very associated with the Kurdish identity. So, for example, even if you go back to the 19th century, you might have a village that speaks Kurdish, right? But because they practice Armenian Orthodox Christianity, they wouldn't call themselves Kurds. They would call themselves Armenians, right?
Oh, wow, that's fascinating. So they speak Turkish, I'm sorry, Kurdish, but because of their religion, they
They would
associate
call
more with
with
Armenia.
Armenia. And one of really, the famous anthropologist Martin van Brunissen, who's probably one of the most well-known scholars of Kurdish society and history, he's done research, and he said, you could come to villages, for example, where they would say we were Armenians, but we became Kurdish, which what they mean is they converted to Islam, right?
That's really interesting. Yeah,
Uh,
because in the Middle East, religion is very much tied to
national,
ethnicities and sex. Yeah.
yeah.
Um, let's take a break here. We'll be back to talk about the influence of Kurdish people in history. We'll be right back. Dr. Bajalan, did the Kurdish people ever have their own polities like a kingdom, empire, emirate?
I mean, the short answer is yes, but of course that question does have kind of implications to it because, we talk about statehood and we talk about, statehood in the modern sense. But historically speaking, there have been several polities that have been led by Kurdish dynasties or Kurdish families, as it were. I would not call those quote unquote Kurdish states per se. I would call them dynastic states, but we have seen examples of that. For example, after the Islamic conquests, as the power of the caliphate began to decline, there were several Kurdish principalities on the borderlands of the Islamic world. The Marwanids of Diyarbakir, for example, are an example of this. Then, obviously, at various points in history, there have been small Kurdish petty kingdoms that have existed, sometimes independently and sometimes as vassals of larger states. And then, of course, you have probably the most famous Kurdish dynasty of the Middle Ages, the Ayyubids of Egypt. And
Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
Salahuddin Ayyubi was of Kurdish origin. But what's perhaps more important is that his rise to power in Egypt, to a certain degree, was based on Kurdish ethnic solidarity within the Islamic armies. This is not to say he was creating a Kurdish state. The Ayyubids were an Islamic state, but there was a Kurdish element that propelled Saladin to power. Occasionally there were tensions between the Turkish elements of the Islamic armies and the Kurdish elements of the Islamic armies. But, they were very much seen as a Kurdish dynasty. There is, in fact, a history of the Ayyubids written after their downfall called the uh, Dawlat al-Akrat, the state of the Kurds, right?
Hmm.
Which I don't like that translation, the state of the Kurds, because it makes us think of a nation state.
Yeah.
I prefer the term the regime of the Kurds. Why do I prefer regime? Because this was a dynastic regime, based on a Kurdish family dynasty and things like that. So, the
If
short,
I may interject for a moment,
yeah,
that's what you're just describing about the Ayyubids. of Egypt, how they were an Egyptian, I'm sorry, a Kurdish regime, a Kurdish dynastic regime.
Mhm.
That's not all that unusual for our audience in the Middle East. For example, the Qajar or the Safavids, where they were a Turkic dynastic regime. I'm using your terms now in Iran. They were not
Mhm.
Persian, but they essentially ruled what was then Persia, right?
Yeah, I mean,
Similar to,
this is the kind of model of statehood we generally have during this
yeah.
period. We don't have a model of nationality in the modern sense of the word.
Mhm.
Uh, Often, for example, to go back to my point about social identities, today people's social identities are very often tied up to their nationality, whether they like it or not, their ethnicity, their nationality. In the pre-modern era, uh, it was often class, guild, and things like that. And sometimes class divisions within a society would become ethnicized, right? Even in Kurdish society, you would have Kurdish speaking peasants and the Kurdish speaking tribes. And the Kurdish speaking tribes say, we're the Kurds. These peasants down here, they would use a term, they would call them Gundi or Guran, which literally could be translated as something like villager, like dehati, like they're not really part of the community. And this is not just in the Middle East. For example, the Polish aristocracy, even though they spoke the same language as the peasants, used to say that they were descended from the Sarmatians, who were warrior people who had come from the east, and these
That's
peasants
funny.
were below them. So,
We're separate from that, from these lower people.
from these lower class
Yeah.
people. So when we look at states in the Middle East, we often use terms like a Turkish state or a Iranian state in an anachronistic way, because the Ottoman dynasty, the Qajar dynasty, any number of dynasties across the region, they might have elements of their ethnic culture in that dynasty, but they didn't envisage themselves as ruling a Turkish state the Ottoman Empire wasn't a Turkish state, it was an Islamic state, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
With a multicultural ruling class, right?
Yeah.
The same with the Qajar state. Yes, the dynast was of Turkic origin, but even the Qajar, if you look at the Qajar kind of genealogy, it goes back to a Kurdish holy man, right? So there's a kind of like,
Interesting.
flexibility in this sense. So
Yeah.
when we talk about states in the Middle East, we have to make a distinction between the kind of dynastic states that existed before the 20th century and the modern system of nation states that emerged after the First World War, and nation states which were defined on the basis of the kind of principle of nationality, that each state has to be, each state is ruled by a people group, right? A nation.
You know, I've spoken to many scholars such as yourself, and every time we come to this juncture, uh, what is a nation and nation state? It's a very murky thing, and I think most people living now don't really appreciate how the world was really the perspective of what is a nation, to what system do you belong to what it's not a country, to what polity, to what organization you belong to, was really different. You started speaking about Kurdish polities or dynasties post Islam. I have a question that's come up from social media. We had a conversation about the Persian Sasanian dynasty. So they were going to talk about how the Persian Sasanian dynasty fell to the Arabs. It's actually an interesting conversation. Numerically, how could this happen?
Mhm.
We'll put that aside. The reason I'm sharing that with you, Dr. Bajalan, is that our social media went berserk. Thousands of comments about, wait, it's not the Persian Sasanian dynasty, it's the Kurdish Sasanian dynasty. I had never heard that, and I'm not saying it's wrong or right. Obviously, I'm Persian. I would love everything to be Persian, right? So, is that something that you've heard before? Is that something that has
Yeah, I
currency?
mean, I think one of the
By
kind
the
of
way, the reason I thought of this is because you mentioned the Gajar connection to Kurdish. That sort of elasticity. You see what
Mhm.
I mean? Fluidity.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is like in modern Middle Eastern political discourse, especially in nationalist political discourse,
Mhm.
there is, often for political reasons, a desire to project back the nation into history, to lay claim to, historical peoples of the past, which may or may not have had connections culturally and historically with the modern group. But this is often, done in order to assert like primacy over a particular territory or region, say we're the indigenous people, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of kind of projecting back into history, a continuity with ancient peoples that may or may not exist, or maybe very, very tenuous.
As they say,
For
the past is a foreign country, right?
it's a foreign, like for example, when we talk about Persians,
Yeah,
there's a huge difference between talking about Persians in the time of Alexander the Great and in the post-Islamic era, right?
exactly. Yeah.
The influence and impact of Islamic culture on what is modern Persian culture is profound and deep, right? There's
Yeah.
a reason why when the Shah in Iran was trying to kind of move away from the traditional Islamic Iranian identity to build a more secular identity, he literally had to kind of do archaeology and like resurrect, and the historian Eric Hobsbawm calls it the invention of tradition. Invent new traditions.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean he's like fabricating the completely, but he's like going back to something that nobody knows about or cares about, and something saying, actually, this is our genuine, deep culture, and you have to do. To use the Scottish example, it's the same with the Highland Games. The sport everybody plays in football in Scotland is football.
Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
soccer, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But they have to pretend like, oh, everybody in Scotland loves the Highland Games because they resurrected this thing to make Scottish people a kind of distinct,
That's a
distinct.
great example. That's a
So,
great
so,
example.
so there is a lot of fighting over like who the Sasanians are. My point is probably the Sasanians are perhaps both common ancestors to Kurds and Persians. It doesn't
Yeah.
make sense to think about this, in this particular way. One of the reasons Kurds often make the claim this is the case is because, of course, the center of the Sassanid Empire was in what is present day Iraq. There's a lot of Sassanid ruins
Yeah.
around the place there. But obviously, if I'm not mistaken, the Sassanids actually originally come from Central Asia, I believe.
There are there.
Closer to Khorasan. And again, with this term Persian as well is
Mhm.
a little bit misleading as well, because this is kind of the generalization. When we talk about Persian, historically people used other terms like Tajik, right? Or
Mhm.
Khorasani and things like that. Persian kind of became the standard word to refer to this kind of cultural complex. But it wasn't necessary. Like when the Qajars wrote documents and they were talking about the peoples of the Qajar Empire, what they didn't say Turku Fars, they said Turku Tajik, right?
Interesting.
Uh,
Wow, that's really interesting. And the Qajar is the dynasty in Iran from the mid to late 18th century to I think 1926. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and when you look at for example, Persian culture, you know, obviously the province of Fars was very important in ancient times, but a lot of the great Persian people are not coming from, they're coming from Khorasan, which includes part of Iran today, this region.
Yeah.
It includes Mashhad and places like that, but it extends across into parts of Afghanistan where they speak Farsi, or
Yeah.
they speak Dari, which is, quite close, is a very close dialect to Farsi, and Tajik, right, which is just Farsi, right? Or put it this way, uh, sometimes it's regarded as a separate language, but the difference between a dialect and a language is a political question. There's a kind of
That's
joke. It's like
interesting.
the difference between a language and a dialect is that a language has an army, right?
That's interesting. Oh my God, I'm going to have to remember that. A language has an army.
Because
Um,
otherwise, why is Dutch and Flemish counted as a different language? Well, it's because they're in different countries. Why is Tajik called Tajik and not Farsi? It's because the Soviets wanted to kind of distinguish their Persian-speaking population from, the Iranian Persian-speaking population and things
um,
like that.
in the minute we have left of this segment, we talked about polities, regimes that were Kurdish based, Kurdish founded. What I'm interested in, and we can truncate this conversation. I'm wondering if Kurdish people or community throughout history played sort of a became a balance of power in the Middle East, played within that larger game, like Persians did. I know Seljuk Turks, even when they no longer had an
Mhm.
empire, they played a role in the balance of power. So how about Kurdish people? Where are they
I
like a
mean,
group? Go ahead, please.
yeah, I mean, obviously in the Islamic armies, you often had Kurdish tribal groups under their own tribal leaders, playing part of military conquest. But, let's say within the broader geopolitics of the Middle East, especially after the fall of the Ayyubid dynasty and the rise of the Mongols in Iran, the Ilkhanate in Iran, and the Mamluks in Egypt, um, the zones of the Middle East which the Kurds inhabited, these mountainous zones, that stretch from the Zagros right into Mesopotamia, that Kurdish people will call Kurdistan, but obviously overlaps with, historical Armenia and other historical Assyria, etc., etc. This region became a kind of front line
Hmm.
between these two empires. And within the context of that struggle between the Mamluks and the Mongols, the Kurds became a kind of element to be won over, right?
Oh
And this
wow, okay.
this continued on, especially during the Ottoman and Safavid period, where again this region formed the front line between these two empires. And because of the geography of the region, because of the logistical nature of the region, there was a kind of competition between these two empires to win over the various Kurdish tribal leaders and aristocratic leaders. In some places you had powerful, let's say, nomadic tribes. In other places you had kind of petty Kurdish kingdoms based on fortresses and towns, and
Hmm.
so leaders would want to win them over. During the early 16th century, there was a big contest over this region between the Ottomans and the Safavids. Initially, the Safavid policy was to repress the Kurdish chieftains of this region and impose their own allies, the Qizilbash, these kind of
Yeah.
fanatical religious supporters of the Safavids, replaced Kurdish leaders with Qizilbash governors. That turned the region against the Qajars, against the Safavids,
Safavids.
and allowed the Ottomans to intervene into the region. And the Ottoman success in the region was in part because they basically kind of made an agreement with the Kurdish nobility of the region. They said, "We'll recognize you in your traditional holdings, in your traditional demesnes, the kind of your land holdings. You'll be allowed to keep those in your family, provided you provide us with military support as vassals." And in response, the Safavids started doing the same thing, right?
Yeah.
And you have much of the early modern period, between about 1500 and right down to the middle of the 19th century, uh, is about the Ottomans and the Qajars intriguing with various, trying to win over this Kurdish dynasty, and like, well, if we get him on our side, this region will defect to us, etc., etc. For example, one very good example is the town of Bitlis, which is located in near Lake Van in present day Turkey. Um, the Bitlis was one of the most prestigious Kurdish kind of petty kingdoms that existed in this region. The ruling dynasty claimed descent from the Abbasid Caliphate. They were very like, it was it had a quite sophisticated economy and occupied a very strategic position. When in the first round of conflict between the Ottomans and the Qajars, the emirs of Bitlis were very important in helping the Ottomans kick out the Safavids. However, a generation later, there was an issue with the Ottomans. They kicked out the emirs of Bitlis. Where did they go? They went to Iran, and they were received by the Safavids very well. They were treated very well. One of the leaders of the dynasty, the grandson the son of the exiled ruler, was raised in the palace alongside the Safavid children and groomed as a Kurdish leader. He was appointed Amira Umara of the Kurds, the commander of the commander of the Kurds in the name of the Qajar dynasty. He was appointed a governorship on the borderlands. And then he fell out with the Safavids and defected to the Ottomans and was reinstalled as the ruler of Bitlis. So
wow.
You had this kind of toing and throwing. And so, there is a kind of irony to this. Today, we talk, Kurdish nationalists will talk about, Kurdistan is partitioned. That's why we're oppressed. But before the 19th century, the fact that Kurdistan, the Kurdish region, was kind of divided into two zones of influence gave the local aristocracy a lot of
leverage.
Leverage, because if one side was taxing them too much or kind of impinging on their privileges too much, they would just defect to the other side. So it was a kind of careful balancing act that had to be played. Now, this changes in the 19th century with state centralization, the establishment of the modern bureaucratic state. Iran and the Ottoman Empire basically have to define their border. They can't be so loosey-goosey with it, with these zones of influence. They have to literally come up with a line, etc. So that changes the dynamic in the 19th century. But for much of this period between about 1500 and 1840, 1850, there's this complex kind of balance of power politics across the region, where you have these Kurdish aristocrats and tribal chieftains who are they're basically pivotal to both the Ottoman and Safavid and then later Qajar strategies for defending their borderlands. In fact, under Abbas the Great, the Safavid ruler, Kurds came to be seen as very good borderland warriors. So as a result, he moved loyal Kurdish tribes, those that were loyal to the Safavids, moved them to Khorasan to defend the frontier of Khorasan against
so from western Iran to northeast Iran, where
and there were right down to the 19th century autonomous Kurdish emirates in right in the middle of Khorasan, which had been established precisely because that was a key strategy of border defense. They were seen as a kind of effective warrior people.
This is fascinating. I'm so glad I asked the question. Let's take a break here. In our next segment, we'll talk about Kurdish nationalism. We'll be right back. Dr. Bajalan, what is Kurdish nationalism?
Well, again, that gets into a complicated question. But perhaps I'll start with a little story about this and about how difficult this term is. A couple of years ago, there was an exchange between two scholars in a Middle East Studies journal, of a fairly unfriendly exchange. And the exchange, very unfriendly exchange. And the cause of the unfriendly exchange was the fact that both of these scholars had written on the origins of Kurdish nationalism. And one scholar was upset because he complained that, he was using the term nationalism in one way, and this other scholar was using it in another way. And so, they were disagreeing because they didn't have the same definition of the term nationalism, right? So
And this
And it,
became a huge issue because nationalism goes to the core of,
well, it goes to I mean, what you define as nationalism
yeah,
will define the way that you present your research,
yeah,
right? The way that you understand your research and the way you frame things. You know, people, and I do agree with this to a certain extent, people will complain about academics using jargon or being pedantic about things, but sometimes there is a reason for that kind of, uh, you know, seemingly pedantic discussion, right?
hmm,
Because, the way we use terms in the vernacular, right, can often be quite imprecise, and we can be talking about different things
yeah,
at different times, right? Like I said, uh, when you're in the United States and you talk about someone as an Italian, you probably mean that they're just like an American who has Italian heritage.
yeah.
Whereas if you're in Europe and you say, "Oh, he's Italian," you will assume, "Oh, he's a citizen of the you know
Country of Italy.
of the country of Italy." So
Yeah.
these things can mean different things in different contexts. So I draw in my research, when I talk about nationalism, right?
Hmm.
Uh, we can talk about different types of nationalism, perhaps cultural nationalism, et cetera, et cetera. But when I use the term nationalism or political nationalism, what I am talking about is a political principle that holds that the national unit and the state unit should be coercion. What does that mean? And I base that on the scholar Ernest Gellner. What does that mean? It's the idea that every nation should have its own state, right? So a Kurdish nationalist or a Kurdish political nationalist, to be more precise, would be someone who says that the Kurds should have their own state. Now, even saying that, we can talk about perhaps different types of Kurdish nationalism, because what do you mean by state? You could mean a sovereign nation state recognized by the UN, etc., etc. Or you could maybe mean something a little bit below about that. Let's say like as an autonomous region or a federal region, like a Kurdish state as part of a federal Iran or a federal Iraq, right?
Or kind of like Scotland. You use
Oh,
that example.
or
And then,
Scotland, yeah, Scotland, which has a devolved government. And, as a lawyer, you probably know the difference.
yeah.
Federalism is you have like a constitutional protection for your autonomy, whereas devolution, you don't have this constitutional protection. But, so when we even say state, we could be talking about a sovereign state. We could be talking about an autonomous state. So when I use political nationalism, I'm talking about people who want to establish some kind of Kurdish state, right?
I see. Let's get
Um,
into the history of this. In the prior segment, we were talking about how Kurdish people played a big role in balance of power in the Middle East from 1500 to the 1840s, but then demarcation of borders and more robust and organized bureaucracies in the Ottoman and Safavid empires ended that.
mhm.
You've written a book which is titled "The Young Kurds: The Kurdish Movement Before the First World War." So now we're going into the late 19th century, which is kind of continuation of what we were talking about previously. So please tell us about Kurdish nationalism
Mhm.
before World War One. Is that where it
Yeah.
started?
Yes. So there's a reason I called the book The Kurdish Movement, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because over the course of the 19th century, we have the emergence of this discourse of nationalism, right? Before the 19th century, it doesn't really exist, but in the 19th century, it becomes a way of understanding the world. It reshapes the map of Europe first, and then obviously in the 20th century, it reshapes the map of the entire world, right? Today, we live in a world of nation states. We have an international organization called the United Nations. If you go back to 1800, the world is divided into just empires. There are
Yeah.
some proto, nation states in Europe, but that system hasn't gone global yet. And the system of nation states around the world kind of over several moments in history kind of progressively spreads around the world. Starts off in Europe and the Americas, and then eventually into the Middle East, into Asia, into Africa, et cetera, et cetera. So the question of nationality becomes a big issue during the 19th century. And during this period, within the Kurdish community, you have the emergence of a movement that is based on the idea that the Kurds constitute a nation. We have this discourse of nationality, and, a growing number of Kurdish intellectuals and thinkers say, well, you know, generally speaking, nations are defined as groups that have languages, myths, shared. That means we're in a group, right? They begin to see themselves as a nation, right? But that doesn't mean they suddenly become Kurdish nationalists, right? Some of them during this period say, okay, we're a nation, therefore we need a nation state, right? We need to create our own separate Kurdish nation state. Other Kurdish activists say, we're a nation, we're a community, but we want to be part of the Ottoman Empire. And we want to get our national rights, language, education, modernization. We want to get those through a constitutional Ottoman Empire, right? So in the 19th century, what we see is progressively, especially in the second half of the 19th century, a growing Kurdish national consciousness, the growing kind of currency of this idea that the Kurds constitute a kind of cultural nation. But within that movement, there's divisions, right? And the main division is between those who want to kind of who think of the national question in terms of having their people educated, having their people have access to modern conditions, like modern technology, ending intertribal conflicts, having social peace. People who envisage that being the core of the Kurdish question. And then you have a growing number who envisage all those things as being part of the Kurdish question, but say that they can only be resolved if the Kurds have a state. So within the Kurdish movement, you have those who are what I call call Ottoman nationalists with Kurdish colors. So what did I mean by that?
Say that again. Ottoman nationalists were Kurdish colors.
Yeah.
Interesting.
What do I mean by that? I mean, they were both proud of their Kurdish identity, regarded themselves as Kurds, but regarded the Kurds as part of they regarded the Kurds as a cultural nation, but as an element of the broader Ottoman political nation. They in fact use this word "ittihadi anasir," the unity of elements. They said, the Ottoman nation is made up of many nationalities, and they all come together to create a political nation. A lot like the United States, right?
Yeah.
The view of a kind of cosmopolitan nationalism, a cosmopolitan Ottoman polity based on kind of liberal constitutional ideas or perhaps Islamist ideas, but seeing the Kurds as a kind of distinct group within a broader Ottoman political nation. That was one tangent. And the other tendency was those who said, like, this is a kind of dead-end project. Need to have our own nation state. We can only resolve these problems if we separate.
We separate, keep our own resources, keep our own identity, and flourish that way. During one of our breaks, you and I talked about the Iranian constitutional revolution in 1905, 1911. The only reason I bring that up, Dr. Bajalan, is this. Having read about this many years ago, I remember that I was fascinated to learn how the Armenians, Georgians, and Azeris, both on the Russian side and the Persian side, in the 19th century, were in constant communication with European movement, even the suffragette movement, women from Azerbaijan and Armenia, even Iranian Azerbaijan. And because of that, a lot of nationalist ideas, I'm not talking about scheming and conspiracies, no, just ideas flowed to these three peoples that I shared with you. Was that the same for Kurdish people? Did they have a lot of interaction with European ideas?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things to consider. So over the course of the 19th century, as part of the centralization politics of the Ottoman Empire, for example, they removed the autonomous princes and chieftains and centrally appointed governors in their place. But they didn't put those chieftains in jail. They brought them to the capital city and integrated them into the Ottoman bureaucracy. So many of these, individuals with noble lineages, ended up being, living in Istanbul, being educated in the new kind of Western style kind of school system that was being established. Some of them went overseas and studied, French, etc., etc. So that's one vector for it. And the other vector is, you know, the Kurdish inhabited regions, people think are kind of like an isolated mountainous region. It was a region between three major empires: the Russian Empire, the Iranian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. You had missionaries, soldiers, armies, businessmen, all coming through these regions and spreading those ideas. Ideas, nationalist ideas, were spreading to Armenians. Well, do you think their Kurdish neighbors didn't know about these ideas and weren't picking
Yeah,
up on what was going on?
yeah, yeah.
Even quote unquote traditional Kurdish tribal leaders, they understood the world was changing. They weren't stupid, right? Many of them, for example, became business people. They said, okay, we're going to get the land registered in our name with these new things called the tapu, with the title deeds, and I'm gonna pay some German exile to kind of bring a new farming thing so I can increase my profits, right? Some of them became like quite shrewd business people,
Like
right?
capitalists in the Middle East.
Became
Yeah, yeah.
became became capitalist. Some of them learned how to squeeze, as they say, the teat of the state. They were like, would get they establish, make relationships with the central government, create kind of militia groups that supported the government, and get modern military training and arms and things like that. So along with all that, obviously these new ideas were spreading to them. Tribal leaders were like, this idea of nationalism is not bad for us. Actually, we can rebel and say we're just doing it for nationalism because we don't like the government taxing us too much, etc.,
Oh, that's fascinating.
etc., etc. So even these traditional groups during the 19th century aren't really as traditional as they used to be, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
That what is a tribal leader? What is a sheikh? I mean, the best example is if you look at Iraqi Kurdistan today, the ruling leaders of Iraqi Kurdistan are the Barzanis, right? Now, the Barzanis are originally a religious group, right? They're not even a tribe. They were a kind of messianic religious group that emerged in a very hierarchical part of Kurdistan, a region of Kurdistan where the tribal differences were almost like a caste system, right?
Oh,
And
wow.
and they began as this kind of like, oh, if you ran away to the Barzan Sheikh, you could marry the girl from the higher class and no one could touch you, if but as long as you could get there, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
It's like you get there, you get married, no one can touch you, but before then they might kill you, right? Um, in this region controlled by the Zibaris. In fact, that's one of the reasons why you might see politicians in Iraq called Zibari, because the Barzanis have this relationship with them. Over time, they kind of emerged as a kind of tribal group based on tribal power, but over time, the basis of their power has changed. Now, yes, they have the tribal lineage, but what is their power based on? They're all business people. They control all the main industries in Iraq, Kurdistan, and they control the apparatus of the state. So, they're the same family, but whereas 100 years ago, they were significant because they could mobilize, 2,000 tribesmen to go raid the local government outposts. Today, the reason they're powerful is because they control, the concession for, I don't know, Whataburger
yeah,
in Arbil and Suleimania. They're business people. They're like capitalists and things like that. So
yeah.
these traditional elites in Kurdish society, they adapted to the realities of the modern world, right?
That
So
is fascinating. Let's take a break here. Stay with me and Dr. Bajalan as we get into the perspective.
mhm,
Dr. Bajalan, we've spent about an hour speaking about the Kurdish people. I just want a point of clarification for myself and perhaps our audience. Is the story and plight of the Kurdish people entirely different, distinct in the Middle East? Or is it that as Americans, we hear more about it now?
hmm. I mean, that's an interesting question. There are certain reasons. I mean, the Kurdish question is not, it has unique aspects to it, but every part of the world, every political question has certain specificities to it, right? Certain idiosyncrasies that you need to understand the question. But in a broad sense, the Kurdish question is not some kind of sui generis question that doesn't exist in different parts of the world. It is, what we call a national question, right? And we've had national questions around the world, since the 19th century. The Polish question in the 19th century, the question of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so national questions have existed historically, and national questions center around, a lot of the time you have a minority group, and you have within that minority group people who make the claim that this group is a nation and therefore should have its own state, right?
Hmm.
Or have some kind of political recognition that falls short of statehood. And often states have been resistant to these kind of movements because they see these as a precursor to separation. So,
Yeah.
for example,
And separation would mean carving out a part of their existing states, such as Turkey, Iraq, parts of Syria, and Iran.
exactly. And ironically, this feeds a kind of negative dialectic because you end up with central governments who increasingly repress the minority group because they fear that they will separate, which only increases the demand for separatism
Yeah.
amongst that group, which ultimately kind of, promotes separatism. So
Yeah.
they very often states' attempts to repress what they perhaps initially incorrectly identify as separatist movements ends up creating separatist movements in the end, if that makes sense.
Yeah, states are fueling the fire that they're trying to put out.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so we've seen this dynamic in many different parts of the world. Like, look at the Irish question, right?
Yeah.
For much of the 19th century, the demands of Irish nationalists, like mainstream Irish nationalists, fell short of demanding full independence from Britain, right? There was demands for returning the traditional Irish Parliament, or various kind of policies to improve conditions in Ireland, etc., etc. But ongoing British repression and refusal to, for example, implement land reform, do these kind of policies, increasingly pushed more and more Irish people towards separatism, right? For example, in 1915, when the Irish nationalists seized the post office in Dublin, many Irish people were like, this goes too far for us. But when the British started just shooting and executing people, people's opinions changed. When like, actually, no, we
Yeah.
do want to be a separate country,
Yeah.
right? So, the same thing could be said of, Kurdish, the Kurdish movement. In the 19th century, you see people, will go, okay, we're Kurds, we want to improve our language and things like that. And then you have central governments get very jumpy about that and be like, oh, no, this is separatism.
Yeah.
And so they, for example, in Iran, for example, in the 1930s, they start burning Kurdish language books, Turkish language books, and
Oh,
saying
wow.
everybody has to speak Persian. It's banned from the public sphere, etc., etc. And that creates kind of a resentment that gets channeled into political nationalism, into separatism. So the Kurdish question isn't particularly unique in that sense. What is kind of special, let's say, about the Kurdish question is that it isn't just a question that affects one country. It's a question that affects multiple countries across the region, and that has implications for, uh, it has implications for, how the Kurdish question has been resolved. What I mean concretely, for example, if Kurds only lived in Iraq, right, that they didn't live anywhere else, I think probably there would be a Kurdish state today, right?
Yeah.
But Kurds
That's
don't just live.
interesting. Okay. Yeah.
I think maybe the United States would have been like, you know what, we'll do a Kosovo. You can have your own state. It's not
Yeah.
really a big deal. The Iraqis will be unhappy, but we'll suck it up, right?
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
But America doesn't have a Kurdish policy, right? America has an Iraq policy, Iran policy, a Turkey policy, and a Syria policy. And even though American officials might be sympathetic, say, the Iraqi Kurds, they really do deserve their own state. They have said, like, though, if we let them have a state in Iraq, that's going to upset Turkey. Turkey's our friend, so we can't do that, right? You
It
know what I
becomes
mean?
very complicated.
It becomes complicated and convoluted in that way, because it's not just an issue that's, for example, if Kurds didn't live in Iran and lived in Iraq, maybe the Shah would have backed them to the end, until they have their own country, and been like, it's not going to upset anyone else except the Iraqis, right?
Yeah.
But because it has this broader implication, you know, um, both regional powers and the great powers are very kind of skeptical, let's say, about Kurdish nationalism or Kurdish separatism, because it will have knock-on effects for their policy. So even if American policymakers might think that creating a Kurdish state in Iraq would be a good policy outcome, the people who work in the Turkey desk will be like, "Whoa, that's going to make our jobs very difficult, and Turkey's an important ally." Et
Exactly.
cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of geopolitical factors that make the Kurdish question complicated in a geopolitical sense, but in terms of the kind of fundamental dynamics behind the Kurdish question, it is similar to other national questions, throughout history and in different parts of the world, where you have a group that feels alienated and is often driven towards kind of nationalist politics by the politics of the state. So the historian Eric Hobsbawm, he once said, it's not nations that make states and nationalisms. It's nationalisms and states that make nations, right? And what I would add to that
Interesting.
is sometimes they make the wrong nation. And what I mean by that, sometimes a state will adopt a whole bunch of policies that will alienate a group and make them start feeling like a nation where previously they didn't, right?
I follow. Yeah.
You know,
You could argue that about many modern nations. For example, maybe Yugoslavia was one of those cases where they made the wrong nation. Although that story is very complex.
well, you can look at that in different identity groups, right?
Yeah.
For example, not just nations, but let's just talk. For example, African Americans, right? We talk about African Americans as like a racial group or an ethnic group. Although, back in the 50s and 60s, there were Marxist intellectuals who were talking about them as a nationality, right? Now, African
Wow.
Americans come from all parts of Africa, right?
Yeah.
Different ethnic groups, different tribal groups, uh, but the policies of the American state kind of implemented a collective trauma upon them,
Yeah.
which led them to identify as African Americans, as a distinct group, right?
That's
Even though
interesting.
they're from many, many different origins, because the American state's policies kind of promoted that group identity, even if that wasn't necessarily the
Yeah.
intention.
Yeah. Do you think we're talking about states when they can make the wrong nation. There's also disturbances within that state. So, do you think the two Gulf Wars, has changed the Kurdish question?
I mean, I think a lot of people assumed that it changed the Kurdish
Yeah,
question,
yeah.
but I don't think it has fundamentally changed the geopolitical calculus.
They have
Huge.
more power. They're better known in the West.
There's certainly, yeah, there's Kurds are better known in the West. Um, it has been convenient, for example, for the American media and the American, foreign policy elite to kind of promote the Kurds,
Hmm.
during the kind of war on terror period as the good Muslims to a certain extent. So
Yeah.
you do have those dynamics coming into play, and of course you had millions of Americans traveling to the Middle East on the government's dime as part of the U.S. Armed Forces, many of whom came into contact with Kurds,
Yeah.
right? Who engaged in military operations aside Kurds. So in that sense, Kurds are more well known. Um, and specifically in Iraqi Kurdistan, the first Gulf War and the no-fly zone established there, and then the autonomous region established there. Although I should kind of side note, Iraqi Kurdistan had autonomy from 1975 onwards. It's just under Saddam Hussein,
Oh,
the autonomy was kind of like on paper, and
yeah,
it was like
yeah,
there's a we'll build you a parliament, we'll build you, you can have like a little like regional government thing, uh, but how real do you think any autonomy for people in
yeah,
Iraqi Kurdistan would be during Saddam Hussein? So the Americans when they you know when they created the no-fly zone, they had plausible deniability, saying like we're not creating a Kurdish state. This is the autonomous state that already existed, right?
yeah, yeah.
For which in Iraq. So, because the Iraqi Kurds, in effect in Iraq got a kind of state within a state with its own government, with its own armed forces, with kind of a direct access to the international community through the United States. I think a lot of people thought that this would have a knock-on effect for other Kurdish communities in Iran, Turkey, and Syria, and things like that. But um, just because that happened in Iraq, it didn't change the geopolitical calculus of of the region. Um, America might be willing to support Kurdish autonomy in Iraq, but they weren't willing to support Kurdish independence in Iraq, as we saw in 2017, because because that will create issues with Turkey, it will create issues with Iran, it will create issues with a number of other regional powers, but especially Turkey. So that fundamental kind of geopolitical conservatism of the great powers towards the Kurdish question hasn't changed, even though the Iraqi Kurds and more recently the Syrian Kurds have kind of gained some kind of political power on the ground, have a bit more leverage than they did in the past. But what I call the fundamental iron cage of Middle Eastern geopolitics hasn't changed. So long as Turkey remains a Western ally and remains hostile to Kurdish statehood, the likelihood of any fundamental changes to the geopolitics of the region seems very unlikely. If people often ask me, under what conditions do you think a Kurdish state could emerge in the Middle East, right? And I
Hmm.
said, honestly, the only conditions I think that where it would be plausible that you could at least have some attempt at establishing a pan-Kurdish state would be if you had the simultaneous collapse in central government power in Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran,
Oh my
right?
God, that would be cataclysmic to the
That
region,
would
right?
be that would be a cataclysm for the region.
Yeah,
Um, but those are the only conditions where it would
yeah,
become a feasible political project. And even then, you would probably have divisions between Kurds from Iraq, Syria, Iran, and uh, Turkey, who have, over the last 100 years, developed their own political parties, their own political traditions, and have their own political visions. For
yeah.
example, the Kurdish movement in Turkey is generally left wing, whereas the Kurdish movement in Iraq is generally right wing. So they have like different kind of conceptions of what their free Kurdistan would look like.
That's really interesting. So even if the conditions, sort of confluence of events, became ripe for creation of a pan Kurdish state, you still have internal, I don't want to call it a strife, but differences, substantial differences. Yeah.
I mean, just look at look at the Arab world. The Arabs have all these states, right?
Yeah.
And uh, they're in a much better position to unify, right? Obviously, there's still, it's not like they're a minority without a state. You have all these states that exist which could theoretically unify, but these too have problems in it. When you had the United Arab Republic, the Syrians became very resentful because they kept appointing Egyptians to all the high positions in the
Yeah.
government,
Yeah. That was in the
except
1960s, I think,
in the
right?
1960s, et
Yeah.
cetera, et
Yeah.
cetera. So, and you can look at pan-Turkism or pan-Iranianism. It's like, the Afghans, the Dari-speaking Afghans don't want to be ruled by Persians. They speak Persian, they
Yeah.
speak Dari and things, but they don't want to be they might be a bit skeptical about joining Greater Iran, right?
Yeah. 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 That makes sense.
And things like that. So, you know, if you did have the collapse of power and all these things, I think instead of having
Simultaneous collapse of,
simultaneously,
yeah.
I think it would be more likely you would end up with, maybe 3 or 4 Kurdish states.
Oh, wow. Jeez. That's interesting. In closing, if you wanted our audience to remember just one point about the Kurdish people after everything we've talked about, what would that one point be?
I would say that the Kurds aren't a monolith, right? That would be the first thing I would say. They're not a monolith. No national group is a monolith. Be wary of people who speak on behalf of the Kurds. Think about who do they represent, who are they, and what are they trying to say? No group is a monolith.
Yeah.
And in modern political discourse, we often end up thinking of groups as monoliths. What I mean is, like, in America, people talk about African Americans are like this, Latino Americans are like that. It's like these groups aren't monoliths, right? They
Yeah.
have their own differences, subdivisions with them. And I would say the same thing is applicable to the Kurds. At the same time as saying they're not a monolith, that doesn't mean that they don't have a national consciousness. That doesn't mean that large numbers of Kurds don't aspire to Kurdish statehood, etc., etc. But recognize the kind of contradictions that exist within any national community. There are always diverse opinions, diverse ideas about what the future can hold, but that diversity doesn't mean that community doesn't exist or is fake, right?
Yeah, I understand that. Dr. Bajalan, thank you for educating me and our audience. And to our audience, if you know of any history that could unravel the Middle East, please share it with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.